Britain's Royal Air Force has flown 200 spy flights over Gaza since December, recording around 1,000 hours of surveillance, supposedly to release hostages. But throughout this time, they must have witnessed atrocious war crimes being committed on the ground by Israel's military. I'm joined now by my colleague Matt Kennard, who's been doing this investigation.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Matt, this is something that you've been monitoring for months now, but to see it reach this scale of 200 flights and what we estimate to be 1,000 hours of surveillance footage, it's deeply troubling, isn't it? Especially when we think that the International Criminal Court might be about to issue indictments against Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes, extremely worrying. And also, I should say that the story out today about the 200 flights, that's information that the Ministry of Defence has withheld from the public. I have asked, and MPs have actually asked as well, about how many spy flights there have been over Gaza since December, and they've refused to give it. So I had to independently reconstruct a timeline of those flights. So obviously they didn't want the quantity to get out. And it's shocking because it's well over one flight a day, 1.3, I think, average flights a day over the past 5 months. Now, the British government say, well, these flights started to help Israel locate hostages. And the British hostages, there's 2 British hostages out of the total of 132 still thought to be held by Hamas. So why do you need often 2 surveillance flights a day to find just 2 hostages? These are 6-hour flights as well. The planes are in the sky for 6 hours. Also, think about Israel's control of the Gaza Strip. They have complete surveillance control of the Strip. They're also on the ground in the Gaza Strip. So the idea that these planes, which are called Shadow R1 planes, can help the Israelis in ways that they can't help themselves is bizarre to me. So, to be honest with you, I believe there's a whole nother story, and the government is refusing to also give us information about how what intelligence is being shared with Israel. So there's many red flags about what this operation, this spying operation by the British military is really about.
Yeah, and one of the striking things in your article, Matt, is the fact that there was one of these spy flights in the air the day that the British aid workers, the 3 British aid workers, were murdered by Israel. Not just on the same day, but it looks like actually at the time that the airstrikes happened. So that obviously raises questions about whether they have any footage relevant to the murder of those 3 British military veterans and all the other aid workers, of course, that were killed. And although the IDF has done this investigation, it hasn't released the full footage from the incident. So perhaps the RAF surveillance footage could shed more light on what really happened. Another thing that you found, Matt, was that one of these flights has actually landed at Nevatim Air Force Base, which is one of the major Israeli Air Force bases. I think that was back in February.
Yeah, on your first point about what these spy planes may have seen in Gaza, well, they've witnessed daily war crimes. There's huge amount of importance to the footage that the British have got from over Gaza, because not only is the ICC rumored to be issuing arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his ministers, there's also the chance that they could issue arrest warrants for British ministers. So we need to see what that footage is. Also, the Israelis obviously aren't going to release footage that makes them look culpable. So the British footage takes on even more importance. And an MP did ask last week whether they would share the footage with the ICC if requested. And the British government refused to even say if they would. They said merely, we only collect intelligence for hostage rescue, but of course they collect all sorts of intelligence when they're over there that relates to other things. So and that becomes even more important when you're talking about the assassination of 3 British aid workers by Israel. And as you say, a UK spy plane was in the sky when that happened. That assassination, which was a series of airstrikes, happened on Monday, April 1st. And is thought to have happened soon after 10:30 p.m. A Shadow R1 plane was on its way back to RAF Akrotiri at that time. So it definitely has footage it's very likely it has footage from just before the incident. And we need to know what is being done with that footage. The families of those British aid workers killed need to know what's being done with that footage. And we need a whole campaign on the government to release the footage, because I don't think that it's public that many other countries have this kind of evidence of war crimes. This is a hugely important repository of information that must be handed over to the ICC, that must be handed over to the ICJ, and must be handed over to the families of the British aid workers who were killed while British spy planes were in the sky.
Yeah, and on that point about whether this footage is going to be shared with the ICC, this was actually raised back in December, a few days after Grant Shapps announced these flights were taking place. There was a debate in the House of Commons, and I think it was mainly SNP politicians who repeatedly asked Shapps, I think up to 5 times, about whether this footage would be shared with the International Criminal Court if it showed evidence of Israeli troops committing war crimes on the ground. And these are the answers that he gave.
I wonder if he agrees that if any information should come out of those reconnaissance missions which sees illegal activity under international law, that it should be handed over to the International Criminal Court.
As I stressed before with regards to the reconnaissance information, we'll be in charge of that information. It will be exclusively focused on hostage recovery and will only be passed to the appropriate authorities.
Will the government hand over any and all evidence of war crimes to the ICC?
I do wonder why the concern is not our hostages being held, and how that could be much faster brought to a conclusion if they were released.
We've heard now 2 questions about the International Criminal Court. Will the UK pass any evidence that it gathers of any breaches of international humanitarian law by combatants in Gaza to the ICC?
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as he says, it has been asked, and I have answered this question a couple of times. That ISR, the surveillance flights, are there to look for our British hostages and indeed other hostages. And that is the information that will be gathered from those flights. Of course, if we saw anything else, we would most certainly alert our partners. But the principle here is to find our hostages and bring them home.
Now, surely if the UK government is actively collecting drone and surveillance images of the war zone, the answer to that question should have been yes.
I would have thought that the number one concern here would be to find and locate British hostages, and that's where that surveillance work will focus.
But the 5th time we're asking, if clear evidence is found of breaches of humanitarian law, will the UK government share that evidence with the International Criminal Court?
Well, the simple answer is we will always follow international humanitarian law and the requirements of it.
Why is the Secretary of State so reluctant to give a clear, simple yes to the question of providing any evidence of war crimes to the International Criminal Court? Is it because he's already seen such evidence? Is it because Israel has asked him to promise not to share such evidence? Or what is the reason?
No. I already said the United Kingdom is bound by and would always observe international humanitarian law.
The way the UK government justifies these flights is that they are supposedly there to help rescue these 2 remaining British hostages, one of whom is unnamed at the request of the family, and the other, we believe, is Nadav Popplewell, a man in his 50s. Their families have actually called on the Israeli government to make a deal so that the hostages are released. So they're erring more towards negotiations rather than using military force to free the hostages, which would seem to counter actually the reason for these spy flights.
Any journalist covering national security should be on these stories. Why is it that only Declassified is covering this stuff? And until the mainstream media really gets interested and starts revealing the UK role, we're not going to see pressure on the government, which we need, and might bring about a stop to this complicity in genocide. Because it's not just the spy flights either. Again, another investigation which we did recently was about the RAF planes which are landing in Israel, huge military transport planes, C-17s and A-400s. Again, there's a lot of obscurity and it's unclear what is on those planes. The military is not being open. And then there's also the Israeli military planes that are landing in the UK, because we revealed for the first time that Israeli military planes had landed at 4 locations in Britain since Israel started bombing Gaza. Now, after that revelation, the Ministry of Defense reversed its previous positions and publicly said, okay, 9 Israeli military planes have landed in Britain since October 7th. But then they reversed that decision again and are now refusing to give any information about Israeli military planes that are landing in Britain. So again, we need the mainstream media to get on this story. The result of that declassified investigation, which showed that the Israeli military had landed in Glasgow, or just outside Glasgow, resulted in the Scottish government rescinding access to that airport for all Israeli military jets. So it had a huge impact, and that's without the involvement of the mainstream media. Imagine if the resources of the mainstream media and the outreach of the mainstream media was being used to really expose the British complicity in this genocide, which is deep and has many, many elements. When it's talked about even by activists, it's always around arms, which is a major issue. But actually, the UK, in terms of arms, is way down behind Germany and the US. Really, it's the logistical support it's providing to the genocide in Gaza in terms of spy flights, in terms of military transport vehicles, in terms of being a stop-off point for Israeli military jets going around the world. We need to expose all this and expose the fact that ministers should be investigated by the ICC and the ICJ in any investigation of what Israel is doing, because they are materially complicit, and we need access to information because we don't know the depth of the complicity. We know these flights, for example, the spy flights are a very, very good example. We know they've gone over Gaza 200 times. We know they're in the air for 6 hours, but we know nothing really about what intelligence they're gathering and what intelligence they're sharing with the perpetrators of the genocide, the Israeli government. So we need all that information out in the open, not just the public, but the legal institutions which should charge Israeli ministers and the Israeli Prime Minister with genocide and war crimes.
Thanks, Matt, for doing this really important investigation. If people haven't read it already, please go to our website, declassifieduk.org, to check it out. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for having me, Phil.